Hey there! Welcome to this video. Let me switch here to my introduction. This is Matt Petrowski, and in this video, we're going to be taking a look at this topic right here, classifying your data structure. And that's what you're going to be interested in when you're going to be putting your data together. So stick with me. We'll be on my desktop in just a second. All right, so in this video, we're going to be taking a look at data structure. Now, if you've been following this series, you may be thinking that the number is out of sequence because I said this is lesson number 1, and that's because I'm breaking everything down into groups. First, we learned the environment of FileMaker. Next, we learned about FileMaker's fields and calculations, just getting familiar with those. And now we're looking at our data structure. And this is going to be a big one. It's basically how do we approach structuring our data? How do we build this into our FileMaker database system? So I'm using an example file that is available to you. Let's zoom in here a little bit and you can take a look. You're probably going to want to choose this option right here of getting started. Now I'm working in a copy of FileMaker 16. If you're using a later version or an earlier version, most of what you learn here will apply to a lot of versions of FileMaker. Really, it's only the little additional things that they add each new version where you're going to have some difficulties whether that feature exists or not. But the core of how you do things in FileMaker really hasn't changed for decades. So we choose that Get Started. That window will come up, at least here in FileMaker 16. As I scroll down, you are going to be looking for this option right here, Explore the Possibilities, and we want to click this option of See Advanced Solutions. So when you click that, up's going to come a window, and the database that I'm choosing to work with is this one right here, Invoices. So hopefully you've had a copy of that. Now, if you've followed the previous series or the little collection of videos where we talked about field and calculations, what's going to happen is you will see I will be using a slightly different version of the database because I'm changing it as I go. So let me show you those two. We have the Invoices original and the Invoices, which is my modified version. So these are both the same copy of the database, except mine has changes in it. So what are you going to see when you open the file originally, if you're following along? You are going to see a relationship graph that's going to look somewhat similar to this, with things sort of in this format, where it's a little bit more difficult to understand. You're also going to see on the fields that you're going to have a lot of fields that have spaces and so forth. Now, I have renamed a lot of things according to my own standards that helps me make sense of a database as I develop it moving forward. That is going to look like this. And I can't really distribute the file because obviously it's a file that FileMaker provides, but maybe after I do enough changes in it, I'll be able to put a link to that down in the description. But for right now, for legal reasons, I'm not going to redistribute FileMaker's own file. Maybe I can get permission from them to do that. But you're going to see that I have rearranged the structure. We're going to be talking about that. Possibly not today, but you will also see that the field names will look slightly different. So you may not be able to follow along exactly. The fields should be named the same, but they will look different. All right, let's head into our topic as I close that original. All right, so we're talking about classifying data in this particular video. And classifying data, this came about because of a question that was by one of the viewers watching this series. I'm recording these live. And it came down to this right here. As I open up the defined database and we look at the tables, one of the things that I had mentioned in a previous video in this series was that formerly this table right here that we're looking at was actually named customers. Now, the one thing that we need to be aware of whenever we're approaching our own FileMaker solution and we are developing it, we're typically imposing upon that solution some type of naming system, some type of classification that applies to the industry that we're working within. So for example, if we're working in, well, let's take this Invoices solution because I shouldn't come up with something off the top of my head. This Invoices solution or this solution in general will probably have a lot of different elements included into it. Let's say, for example, in invoicing, you're going to have customers, you're going to have vendors that you purchase from, and then the question that was posed to me is, what about employees? Shouldn't I make an employees table? Now, here's what that would ultimately look like. Let's go through the process. If I had a table called customers, and let's make that customers, and I'll click change, and I had a table called vendors, and I had a table called employees. What I've done in this scenario is I've created 3 tables for the exact same type of data. Now let me open up my little tool here, my highlighter tool, so that we can actually talk about this as this comes up on screen. Highlight is I should have had that open before, but I did not. There we go. Writing actually works. All right. So here's our primary problem with this scenario. When we start thinking about our solution in terms of its constituent parts, or what we think are parts, rather than what we're absolutely dealing with, we end up with a problem, inevitably and always. And the problem that I explained was, in customers, I'm going to have somebody, well, actually, let's do it this way. I'm a company, and I have somebody who works for me, and his name is John. Now, John, terrible pen there. Should get a little tablet. John is going to be assigned an ID value. Now, in this series, I've been promoting and telling you, don't use a serial number. If you already have a FileMaker database that is using serial numbers, don't worry. It's not a significant consequence to you. It just means that your database isn't necessarily ready to go out into a disconnected world and be able to synchronize and have multiple copies create records at the same time, because you end up creating duplicate numbers when you use serial numbers. So we're going to pretend that John has this ID. It's like a UUID of 94B2. And that's just the first part. That's the first 4 letters of a UUID, which would be a long string of anywhere up to 50 characters or what have you. Needless to say, this is basically going to be completely unique to John. But the problem that we're going to have is if John is no longer an employee for us, and John now moves on, but John really liked the products that we sold, John comes back as a customer. And what happens is I now create a new record, and it is John again. And of course, you're going to have multiple Johns. So let's call this John S. And we have another John S. Well, because we created a new record in the customer table, John now gets a new ID of 382X. I don't know. I don't even know if they use X's. So herein lies our problem. And let's say even further down the road, and I won't take the time to write it out, John, he liked our products so much as an employee, and he got so used to them as a customer that eventually down the road, he designs a great product that we now want to sell as the business owner. Do we yet want another John down here? The answer is no. We definitely do not want these multiples. So this equation is very common in situations when you start to work with parts and breaking down those, well, not parts. A part in the world of putting together a piece or a product, the part should be the final piece. Each part, you can consider a screw a part to a larger mechanism, to a larger engine. So we don't think of the engine as a part. Well, we do think of it as a part. I'm going to sell XYZ engine versus ABC engine. But really, it's composed of multiple little parts, which are the parts that truly can't be broken down anymore. So in this scenario, a person is our ultimate object. We can no longer break down a person to anything other than that. They are a person, but they get a classification. They are one of these things. They are a customer. They are a vendor. They are a student. They are a teacher. They are an advisor. They're an instructor. All of those classifications are things that you want to apply from the standpoint of the data, not from the standpoint of how you want to store it, because we do not want these duplicate IDs. We want in our database only one John S, and we want him to only have one primary unique key. everything else in the rest of our database with regards to pulling John out of that database and showing him in the context of how he needs to be viewed is basically pulling it out based on the classification. So let's add this down into our database. Let's quit talking about theory and let's actually make it happen in this solution. And I'm going to delete all of these. Actually, I'll just click cancel on my graph and discard all of those changes. So what does classification look like? Where there's a bunch of ways that you can classify data. And if you go back to some of my previous videos where we talked about FileMaker, it was either in the environment section or in the field section. I'm starting to create so many videos now, but I wish I could reference the video. If you've been following the series and you want to take the time and you want to put a comment in the notes and help me out, go ahead and do that. Otherwise, I'll search for it. Where we talk about FileMaker's text fields and how those text fields can have multiple values. So we're going to start out with the bad way of actually classifying data, and we'll see why. So I'm going to go up here to the File menu, and we're going to create a value list, because a value list is one of the easiest ways to classify this data. So in here we have a number of value lists, and even with value lists we will see that you can classify data. So we're going to click New, and then I'm going to create person type or type of people or whatever makes sense to you. Now again, this is not something, we're going to rectify this solution, but we're taking this approach as a FileMaker learner in terms of what most FileMaker and learners will do. Well, now that I know that I need to use classification, I'm going to simply say that I've got John is either going to be a customer, or he's going to be a vendor, or he's going to be an employee. And we'll see how we can actually pull these out of the data at any time. So we've got the person type now. So now we need to go to a record, which is our person table or our people table. Customers, we can see that FileMaker itself is already using classification in order to identify things, which sort of locks you in when you think about it. Because as soon as you want this database to deal with vendors or employees, do I need to make another vendors layout? Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. I am going to go to customer, not iPad, I want to go to desktop, and customer details is what I want to do, because that's the layout that's tied to my table occurrence. If you don't know what I'm talking about, let's take a quick check, make sure that we stay on board. All of these table occurrences on my graph connected together establish the context. It's basically the world view based on a layout being tied to that particular table occurrence. So the world view of this particular table occurrence is that from people, it can see how many invoices that person has. So if I create a layout based on this, it can see anything that's connected to it. If I created a layout based on a disconnected table occurrence over here, what can it see? Pretty much nothing. So in the world of FileMaker, context is described by whatever that current layout points to in terms of the table occurrence and what it can see that's connected to it. So inevitably, the layout is tied to people. That's going to be, well, it was formerly called customers. FileMaker renamed it for me when I renamed the customers table to people. And FileMaker does that. Until you come in and you actually explicitly change a table occurrence name or a label that's automatically added, you have to remember that anything that FileMaker does automatically, unless you change it the first time, if you rechange it within the actual data structure, rename the table, rename the field, rename the table occurrence, FileMaker attempts to keep up with you and make those changes. It's a bit annoying actually in FileMaker once you get your names to what you want, but this table occurrence was in your database is probably called customer, something to that effect. When I renamed the table, it got renamed to people, which is fine for right now. We'll eventually look at, within our structure, renaming our table occurrences. But for right now, we can always see what a table is connected, what a layout is connected to in terms of the table occurrence, either in the layout mode or within the manage layouts. So when we click on the little button right here, or we hit Command or Control L in order to edit the layout, we can see when we're in this layout, let's move the inspector to the side, that yes, indeed, this particular table or this particular layout, it's very easy to get confused by all of these terms, is connected to the people table occurrence. So that's our perspective. Excellent. Well, we need to put that field that we're going to add onto this particular layout. So we go into Define Database. We go to our fields. Now, the first thing that we did was we just created a value list. And that value list is actually going to have the type of person that it is. Now, as we look through all of our fields here and the renaming that I've done, one of the easiest things to do in FileMaker is to sometimes get a little more complex than you need to get. In this case, I'm thinking, what type of person this is. The question that just went through my head, what type of person this is, that's the answer typically to what you want to name this field. I'm just going to put in quite simply type. Now you may be thinking I need to be more specific in that. I need to put type of person, because in the rest of my FileMaker database, I might have a type of machine, I might have a type of vendor versus a type of customer versus... This is where you can evolve your database as you move it forward. If type of person is more descriptive and you like to use that, go ahead. I like to start out generic and just say type, because what happens, I've stated this before in a previous video, is when you look at the full string that FileMaker uses in most of your calculations, in your coding and scripting, you're going to get the table occurrence that comes with it. So I'm already going to get something that's going to look like this, people type. So if I contrast that against type of person, yeah, it's more descriptive, but it's also a little bit redundant. So I like to just keep things simple. What is the type of people? And yes, you have to look at this in reverse and say, okay, this is going to be type of people. But remember, you can always rename, and FileMaker flows throughout the whole of the system. So it's pretty nice. All right, so we create that type field. So we're now ready to start classifying this data. We, of course, need to put it onto the layout. Layout's going to get a little bit busy, and we're going to be having to reorganize. We'll get into that when we're going to do our working with layout mode and our design. I am going to take the opportunity and just put it, I'll just put it right here under job title, and I'll clean it up a little bit later. I option dragged that field, and I'm going to scroll down, find type, double click, and assign. Now remember, anytime that you option drag a field, you're actually taking a potential risk, because everything that's been added onto that field comes with it. What are the things that get added? Well, as we've learned before, they could be a tooltip, they could be a hide calculation, they could be on the field in this fourth area of the inspector, it could be a placeholder text, anything, a value list, the control style of the object. I can see right here, because I took that job title, I didn't get just a regular field, I actually got a drop-down list, when what I want is probably an edit box or a checkbox set, which in this case I want a checkbox set. So remember, if you option drag from like a blank field off to the side, or add a field in one of the other ways. We'll take a quick look at that. Right now, I'm just going to set my person type value list. So I now have the ability to classify this particular person. And what were those other ways of adding a field? Well, quite clearly, they are this one right here, where you can just drag a field onto the layout. That comes clean and without anything attached to it. Your alternative is to use the field picker, and you can do that with the Command or Control K, which will bring up the heads-up display. And from there, you would be able to search and filter down, especially if you have a lot of fields, and drag type out onto the layout. So those are just the three different ways if you didn't already know that. We'll delete that, and we now have our classification. All right. So now with this classification, I can create a new record. That can be a new customer. I don't need that. I'm just going to put my first name of Matt and Petrowski. Now, of course, I am now able to be classified as a customer and an employee. And when I go in and do a find for this, I'm going to be able to filter out all of these people based on any one of those classifications, of course. So I'll create another new record, and we'll use my example of John S. We'll just go for generic John Smith, and currently John Smith is only an employee. So of course, I can go into find mode, which is FileMaker's query by form, which is whatever the form is that is being shown when I go into command to find mode. I did that with Command F. If I just want to find all employees, I just click employee and it finds all employees. Quite clearly, I found 2 records out of 2 in my total database. If I wanted to view just the customers, I would just do a find just for the customers. Now, the key thing to remember in this scenario is that all of this type of filtering can all be done through scripts and through using our portal tool. It's very easy to use a portal to only show employees. Likewise, we can only show vendors and we can only show customers. It's also very easy that when we go to a dedicated layout, let's say that we design a layout just to show employees because we're going to present data differently for an employee versus a customer. The second that I get onto that layout, you can use a FileMaker script trigger that will just load only employee records because of that find right there. So the key thing with your classification of data is remembering that your classification, when you do it within the context of data, rather than within the context of breaking it out into tables, you can always get access to the data that you want to. It's just a simple matter of a filter. And when I use the word filter, I'm referring to either an explicit find or the way that you wire up relationships in order to only show what you want to show. So in FileMaker, we're not necessarily thinking in terms of finding data. That may be what you're used to, but we're going to be thinking about it in terms of filtering data. Out of all of our data, we want to filter what we actually want. Now, I mentioned that this is probably not the best way to go about this in terms of structuring this data. This is not how I would do this professionally as a FileMaker developer. And as a FileMaker learner, it would be fine for me to drop you off at this point, but this is not what you would do if you're going to create a professional FileMaker database. Reason being is that words change and values change. And when they change, that becomes a problem. Herein lies the problem. Let's go change our value list. And tomorrow we'll be getting into actually using an enumeration and building a value list. But we need to understand why this becomes a problem. And this is so common in the world of FileMaker development. We'll go to the value lists and we will now change our value list. Now, for some reason, you might think this would never happen to you and you would never do it, but you have to know that this problem exists. If I use FileMaker's custom values and in a professional FileMaker database, I never, ever use custom values. And I never use actual strings. I use what's called an enumeration, and that's where we're going to use numbers to assign the classifications with a value list that comes from a table. And that's what we'll be building tomorrow or in the next video in this series. Because as soon as any other developer, or I as the developer, do this, employees, and say, okay, I have made a change to the value list, you can see what happens right there. Matt was already set as an employee, but it just disappeared. Well, that's not true. It's still there. If you go back and watch that video that I'm referencing about field types, when I drag this field over here, I'll make a copy of this exact field, put it on the layout, and I zoom out. I'll zoom in over here on my palette, and I will set this to a regular edit box and scroll this out just so I can see what the heck happened. Go into browse mode now. We can see quite clearly the employee without the S is still there. But when I check this box of employees, well, that's really crummy. I mean, I can go in and I can search for now employee and employees, but employee, just because of that change to that value list, just went away. Now, granted, this probably doesn't happen to you a whole lot, but unless we know that it happens, when it happens to us the first time and we can't figure out, well, wait, Matt was checked as an employee, this becomes a very big problem. Likewise, if I ever wanted this database to work for multiple languages and I wanted to simply display the word employee, then that really doesn't work. It's not a good system. It's not robust. It's not fault tolerant. It breaks down. And that's how a lot of people, or a lot of ways when you're learning FileMaker, they tell you, here, do it this way. I'm going to teach you the right way. We're going to be doing it in another video, but I'll explain it really briefly. And this classification that we just learned about today, you're going to see also applies to value lists. We are going to use or create in this database one table called values. In fact, I'll do it right now if you'd like to follow along. I'll go into my define database. I'll go to my tables, and within this, what some developers, new FileMaker learners might be tempted to do is to create a brand new table for all of the different possible value lists that they might end up having. Just like I can classify people into their classifications that I'm mentally thinking about, customer, vendors, etc., I can do the same thing for value lists within FileMaker. And it becomes extremely empowering because the structure of our database stays really, really trim. It doesn't become bloated, and it is very efficient. So I'm going to put in a table right now of values if you want to follow along for getting ready for tomorrow's video. And we will be able to start to classify data. In fact, let's go ahead and do it right now while we're here. I am going to put in a value of ID. Now, every database that we create is going to have an ID value, and it's going to actually be an ID value that is a UUID. Actually, before I do that, I'm going to take the shortcut way because I really don't like doing extra work. I'm going to put in value, and I'm going to create that, and I'm going to put in category because category is our classification of the value that's going to be available as a value list. Now, why did I not create the ID? Well, I don't like to take the time. I know that I already have an ID field that's structured the way that I like. In this case, let's see, over on people, actually invoices is where it is. I need to change that ID. I haven't done that yet. Here is where I have changed it in the invoices as it comes from FileMaker. I've changed it from a number to a text. It is an indexed field. When we look at the auto enter values, we can see that it is a calculated value. That calculated value is a UUID right there. I'm not replacing and I am prohibiting modification. So knowing that I already have that field, I'm just going to copy it with Command C. I'm going to go over to my values table and I'm just going to paste it with Control or Command V. So there we go. There is our rudimentary structure of how we are going to be structuring this, and we're going to have to do that in the next video. Because this classification that we've got going on right here is going to break down to looking something like this. We're going to use an enumeration, and we're going to say all customers are a value of 1. All employees are a value of 2. And that's in perpetuity for the database. And this can be something else. It can be some other language that can be describing this, because what's going to get assigned to the actual person is the number value. The number 1 is going to be in this value list right here. And if they're an employee, the number 2 is going to be assigned to that person. When our database, when a user comes in and they search our database, it does force us to go outside of FileMaker's comfortable way of searching. In other words, for me to search this FileMaker database, I can come in and I can just simply go into find mode, click this box, FileMaker will look for all employees, and everything will be wonderful. Now, I need to stress, everything that I'm teaching you here is based on just years and years of knowledge in terms of what you want for the greatest degree of flexibility. But when it comes to adding in this flexibility that I'm talking about, it takes away some of the ease of use that you normally have in FileMaker. No user is going to be able to come in, and if I have behind the scenes a value list that is the person type, they're not going to know if a user went into find mode and I had this field, which I'm going to get rid of these values for right now. And let me quickly fix my value list here so that things are as I expect, because we just need to have that be something that is the way that the user searches. Employees, let's see, there we go. All right, so we'll put the data back like this, and we'll go into FileMaker's find mode. So I'm in FileMaker's find mode. Is a user going to know I'm searching for all customers? I'll put the value of 1. No. End users are not going to know how to do that. But you, as the developer of the database, you will have to build into your search. You will write a script that will actually say, when the user goes into find mode, or better yet, you actually give them just a button that they click that says, show me all customers, show me all employees, show me whatever. You then take over at that point, run the script, and just show the user what they want to see based on clicking that customer's button. So there's some things that we'd like to rely on. Of course, first name, we want to be able to search on that. But if we're going to search on customer, vendor, or the person type, we're not going to expect that the user will search based on our enumeration or assignment of numbers to the classification that we're using. So we're going to have to build in that functionality, and that's ultimately what we're going to do. And fortunately, it's not that much effort. So if you have any questions about today with regards to understanding why we approach this from the standpoint of what is the ultimate entity and how can we just classify the data and then filter it out of our database based on what we want to present when we want to present it, now is a good time to put those in because we're going to be switching over to the questions and getting to that. And in the upcoming video, we will be taking the time and setting up this enumeration, looking at how we can actually create a value list and using that enumeration, because that's the next thing that you need to learn is using value lists in the best way possible with FileMaker. So let's switch over to my video, chat, and take a look at what we've got there. Show that window. And see what we've got. All right, we've got a number of questions that came in, so let me scroll up here. Hey, Rick, first time watching live. Very cool. Got over here. Morning, HBH Group, one of my regulars for these videos. Hi from Mexico. Carlos, how you doing? Evening, Eric. Yep, and all right. Eric, here's a question. Is it an option to change the serial numbers to a UUID? Here, this is a good question. In fact, I got this question, I think, via email of, I already have a database. It's with using serial numbers, but I want to switch to using UUIDs. Yes, it is definitely possible to do that. Now, you're going to have to write a routine where you're going to assign all of the records that still are using serial numbers. You have to reassign them to using UUIDs. But once you do that, you can then drop off your serial numbers. If it warrants it, I can create a video about that. We can take the invoices solution, and then we can actually create a bunch of records and then write a script that will take us from serial numbers to UUIDs. So put your comments down in the comments below. If you put them in the chat right now, they don't persist because this chat window goes away. But yes, it is definitely possible, but we have to write a routine that will actually do that. And we will use FileMaker's replace function in order to make that happen. And we can certainly move from serial numbers to UUIDs. Totally possible. Data's like water. It always flows. So companies should be in the same table as well if you want to link people to those companies. Companies, you think about this, a company is an entity separate from people, and yes, it can have, you would have a companies table, but within companies, you can have different types of companies. A company can be a company that as an entity is a vendor to you. Then within that company, you can have multiple contacts. So you end up having a join relationship in that where you join multiple people to one company or to multiple companies, because sometimes think about a sales rep that maybe works at 2 different companies. So in that case, you may have a person that is an employee of 2 different companies and also a customer of 1 or many other companies. So you always want to break down to whatever the smallest unit is and then classify. All right, don't read the foreign language myself, but we've got some other people obviously that probably do in the chat. So your initial approach involved here using one field for customer, employee, vendor. Why not 3 separate fields? Don't know why that highlight is taking over right there. Can't get rid of that highlight. You'll have to excuse that. Okay, structuring data. This is just my approach. It is definitely a viable option to use a separate field for each of the different types of classifications. So yes, you could certainly create a field that is going to be a Boolean value of yes or no. Is this person a customer? And another field for employee, yes or no, is this person an employee? And a yes or no, is this person a vendor? The issue that you come across sometimes when you take that approach in order to use multiple fields for the purpose of classification is you're growing the, we're going to get into a video talking about narrow versus wide tables, but you start making your table much wider. Now, from a data standpoint, the consequence is very minimal because there's no consequence to you to have an empty field. In fact, very much in programming, you can actually leverage the fact that if a field is empty, by default, that field implies that that particular record or that particular piece of data is not included into any other designation. So if I had a database where I did have different types of customers that I wanted to classify, let's say I had customers that as soon as they spent more than $5,000 with me over a given year, and there's other ways to figure this out, I wanted to move that customer from a level 1 customer, which is a brand new or a sub $5,000 customer, to a level 2 customer. So in that sense, it would make sense because I would need to track the distinction of types of customers, and I would need to have that particular field. But of course, I could do that another way as well. If I was taking the approach that I'm taking now, where I have just one field called type for a customer, or for a person, and I say that person is a customer, but then I have a separate field just that I name based on spend level. And that spend level uses the enumeration of at level 1, they've spent less than $5,000, but as soon as they spend $5,000, I move them to level 2. I can still search the database for what is this person type, they're a customer, and then give me all of my customers that have spent more than $5,000. So that's a level 2 customer, and that data is filtered out. It's exactly what I want to get. So the approach really comes down to how you need to structure your database. And you have to think about this a little bit before you actually program your database and think about what are all the other scenarios that could possibly pop up? How are all of the different ways that I've dealt with whatever the aspect is that I'm dealing with in my database, whatever the database is for? And we may see that. I may use an example of a time-checking database that I actually use. All right, so Eric asks, is it easy to change if you can do that with a script step replace field? Yes, replace field contents is what we will initially use on the primary table where the primary key is. You'll create the ID field, use a replace field contents. Then you'll have to write a loop that will loop through all related records and assign the primary key, the new UUID, to all other records that are related to it. All right, at what point does the ID serial number get generated, and at what point does it get generated into the DB in the process of record creation? Andre, this is a good question. A serial number or a UUID, those are all controlled based on this setting right here. We have not spent a whole lot of time on this particular setting. Let's switch to invoices just so we can take a look really quickly at the settings for the field. If you've watched my previous videos, then you know that I am suggesting you do not use this option of serial numbers in a modern database. If you have already used serial numbers, it's okay. We're not too worried about this, but this option right here of on creation versus on commit deals with transactions. Most database systems are transaction-based systems. FileMaker itself, by default, wants to make things easy for users. So when you get into a high-use FileMaker database, typically you want to start to deal with transactions. And when you want to deal with transactions, and it's definitely beyond the scope of this video, you can go look at some videos, search YouTube. I think you'll find a lot by Todd Geist. It's a really complex topic. If you're going to a transaction model, that's when you switch to the on commit that we see right here. By default, FileMaker is going to be on creation. So as soon as you create a new record with Command or Control in or via a script, via a button, FileMaker automatically assigns a serial value, and then that record gets written to the database. If you do it on commit, what happens is when you create a new record, FileMaker sort of reserves the ID, but it's not actually put into the database until the record is actually submitted. And this is also tied to a setting that's on each individual layout. Each individual layout can have its own setting with regards to whether it has transactions or whether it does not. By default, all FileMaker databases that you create, the layouts and the IDs that you create, if you use serial numbers, are all based on record creation, not on commit. You have to turn on transactions if you want to use them. Again, another video for another time. So hopefully that gives a little bit of clarification there. All right, we'll do a few more questions here. Switch back and switch to my copy of the questions. All right, reminder, 24 watching. Cool, thank you for the thumbs up there. And all right, there we go. All right, we're down to the bottom, and that's going to be a wrap for this video. 40 minutes. All right, like to keep these roughly 30 minutes, 30 minutes of learning and some time for questions. I hope this has helped you out with regards to data. I know that currently what the situation is that it's very easy to get confused as we go along, but eventually things make sense. Like, why is he going to assign a person to be a type based on a number? Using this thing called enumeration, and we will see. And tomorrow will be really fun, in fact, as we go over our topic of the value lists. So thanks a lot for watching. As we wrap things up, remember, you can always check out, if you want more advanced videos, you can check those out at FileMakerMagazine.com. Very reasonable subscription. This is all my beginner stuff. If you want tips, techniques, all kinds of cool stuff, check it out over there, and I guarantee you'll like what you see. And so I think that's going to bring this one to a close. I always like to say much luck with your own FileMaker development and happy FileMaking. If you'd like to subscribe and be notified via YouTube, you can do that here. And on the next video, or the next video will be coming up right here. Until then, see you later.